The men who built America's wildest loudspeakers spent their day jobs aiming a 4.5 million watt laser at targets in Vietnam. The servo loop that held that laser on target ended up driving 4 towers, more than 100 drivers, and a $60,000 price tag. 20 years of design, from the Servo-Statik to the Ursus V, in one place. They bet the company on it, twice. Most people know Infinity as a badge on a car dashboard, but for 2 decades it was the most extreme speaker company on Earth, and it existed only because a weapons lab solved an audio problem by accident. In 1968, there were 3 ways to build a loudspeaker, and none of them fully worked. The first one was Edgar Vilcher's. Put a 12-inch woofer in a sealed box and let the trapped air act as the spring. It worked so well that by 1966, his company, Acoustic Research, controlled more than 1/3 of the American speaker market, the highest share ever measured in this industry. Their flagship arrived in October of '67, the AR-3A, the most accurate loudspeaker money could buy. But it had a problem nobody knew how to solve. A paper cone has weight. When the amplifier tells it to stop, the cone doesn't stop. It keeps moving on its own momentum, pushing air that isn't in the recording anymore. Up in the treble, it doesn't matter. Down in the bass, it changes everything. That's why bass in 1968 sounded huge and blurry at the same time. The speaker wasn't reproducing the note, it was reproducing the note, plus its own resonance. The second way was electrostatic, a paper-thin membrane suspended between 2 charged grids. No cone, no mass, no inertia. The KLH-9 did things with a human voice that no cone could imitate. But a membrane like that barely travels a couple of millimeters, and the lowest notes aren't a question of precision. They're a question of how much air you move. So the electrostatic solved exactly what the cone failed at, and failed at exactly what the cone solved. The third way was the horn. Klipsch. Brutal efficiency, but a coloration in the mid-range you couldn't unhear once you'd heard it. 3 schools, 3 compromises, and an entire industry that had accepted choosing as part of the job. 30 miles away, in a laboratory in Woodland Hills, 2 men who didn't work in audio were solving the same problem for completely different reasons. A laser fired from a moving aircraft at a target on the ground drifts too, and the only way to correct it was to measure where it was actually going. Compare that to where it was supposed to go, and feed the difference back into the system. Thousands of times per second. That loop had a name. It was called a servo. Nobody had ever put one inside a paper cone. For 18 months, in a garage in Los Angeles, somebody tried. And what came out of there would cost more than any other loudspeaker on sale in the United States. They didn't invent it, they found it. They walked across the hall to the Lytton Engineering Library and pulled a copy of Acoustical Engineering by Harry F. Olson, the first Bible of acoustics. Inside was a single page on servo-controlled loudspeakers. 1 page, a block diagram, and no analysis. The idea had been sitting in print for years, waiting. Nobody had built it. Nudell calculated the radiation resistance. Ulrick designed the servo and the amplifier to drive it. For the woofer, they called Gene Cervinsky, an engineer at Bendix who built speakers in his garage on weekends, and asked him for an 18-inch cone with a second winding over the voice coil. The electrostatic panels came from 2 more aerospace engineers at Atomics International, the nuclear division right down the road. Ron and Bob. Only the first names survive. Years later, Ulrick asked the obvious question. At this point, you have to wonder who was actually building all those weapons systems. What came out of it looked like no loudspeaker on Earth. It was 3 boxes. 2 paper-thin panels, 28 inches by 36 and barely 7 deep, and a 2-foot cube with an 18-inch woofer firing straight down at the floor. 1 woofer, a single one, for both channels. It sounds like a design error, and it isn't. Below 100 Hz, the human ear stops locating the source. You can tell there's bass, you can't tell where it's coming from. So Infinity pulled the bass out of stereo altogether, put it in 1 box, and spent the entire budget on a single enormous woofer instead of 2 mediocre ones. The sensing coil was wound over the voice coil. When the cone moved, it generated a voltage proportional to its real motion, not the motion the signal had ordered. That voltage went back to the amplifier, got compared against the original signal, and the difference was corrected on the fly. For the first time, a loudspeaker knew what it was getting wrong. $1,795. At that moment, the most expensive speaker listed in the stereo review directory was the JBL Metragon at $1,230. 3 men walking out of a garage had just put the most expensive loudspeaker in America on sale. They had no business plan because they didn't know what one was. They picked their first president with a coin toss. They were going to call the company NewTek, for Nudell Ulrick Technology, but the name was taken. Infinity was third on the list. And it worked. J. Gordon Holt, the founder of Stereophile, wrote that it was one of the 2 most accurate reproducers he'd had the good fortune to hear. A kid who heard it in a dealer's showroom said it was like jumping from a Model T to a supersonic fighter. That kid was named Gale Sanders, and he would go on to found Martin Logan. But it broke. When Holt got a unit into test, the crossover started blowing fuses until the whole thing had to be replaced. 2 power supply boards failed, a transformer shorted against its own casing, and 2 of the mid-range panels split. All of that in 1 unit. The problem was physical. An electrostatic panel is a sheet of mylar suspended between 2 grids carrying thousands of volts. Dust holds a charge. Humidity conducts. And where you have dust, humidity, and high voltage, sooner or later you get an arc. Sanders described it without decoration. The panels deteriorated practically in front of your eyes. They had built the most advanced loudspeaker in the world, and it couldn't stay switched on. So alongside the most expensive system in the country, Infinity put 2 other things on the market. A bookshelf speaker at $239, and another one at $119. Nobody remembers them, but that decision would shape the next 20 years. The 2 speakers nobody remembers did something the Servo-Statik couldn't. They sold, and there's the engine that defined Infinity for 2 decades. They didn't design one cheap product and one expensive one. They built the impossible thing first, without looking at the price, and then walked that technology down the ladder. They said so in their own brochures. Of the 1001A, they claimed they'd packed in the know-how they'd picked up building systems that cost 12 times as much. It was advertising, and it was also true. The 2000A arrived in 1971, a 12-inch woofer, a cone mid-range, and 4 electrostatic strip tweeters. 4. Electrostatic. In a bookshelf speaker, $578 a pair. And there's the obsession that runs through the entire catalog of that decade. The 2000A's tweeters sat in a cavity that let sound out the front and the back. The 1001A, from 1973, had 1 dome facing the listener and another mounted on the rear of the cabinet, aimed at the wall. Nobody did that. The whole industry was working to make speakers fire forward and only forward. Infinity did the opposite on purpose, because an orchestra doesn't throw sound in your face either. It reaches you off the walls. But the strangest move came in 1973. On top of the monitor's cabinet sat a gold metal cone mounted upside down, like an inverted ice cream cone. That was the tweeter, and it didn't radiate forward. It radiated 360 degrees. It was called the Walsh after Lincoln Walsh, an engineer who designed high-voltage power supplies for radar during the war. The wave traveled up that metal cone faster than sound travels through air. In their own brochure, Infinity compared it to a laser beam. A laser physicist selling a tweeter on its resemblance to a laser. There was only one problem. The patent wasn't theirs. It was number 3424873, and it belonged to Ohm Acoustics. Infinity was manufacturing its best component under license from a competitor, and paying for every single unit that went out the door. So there were 2 ways out: keep paying, or build something better. They didn't answer that right away. They got distracted, because the company that existed to build the ultimate loudspeaker spent a good chunk of the 70s building things that weren't loudspeakers. A tone arm, for instance. At a time when a high-end arm was an aluminum tube, Infinity released the Black Widow with the tube made of carbon fiber. Stated effective mass, 3 grams. The Absolute Sound wrote that they couldn't think of a finer pivoted arm anywhere in the world. Then there was the amplifier. Ulrick went back to what he knew from Lytton. In an aircraft, you can't run linear amplifiers, because they waste most of their energy as heat. You run switching amplifiers. Instead of metering the current out, you switch it on and off thousands of times per second. He called it the Swamp. 250 watts per channel, switching at 500 kilohertz. It shipped in 1976. Today that technology is called Class D, and it's inside your soundbar, your car, and your phone. And here you have to be careful with the word first. Sinclair Radionics was already selling switching amplifiers in the 60s, but they didn't sound good. The Swamp was the first one that worked, and then there was the Monolumia, a laser light show for your living room, sold by a loudspeaker company. It failed constantly. When somebody asked Nudell about it years later, he said he wished they'd never made that damn thing. All of it brilliant, all of it built in absurdly small numbers. And the whole time, Infinity kept paying Ohm Acoustics religiously for every tweeter that went out the door. That ended in 1976. In 1976, Infinity stopped paying Ohm Acoustics. The replacement was called the EMIT, electromagnetic induction tweeter. Forget the cone, forget the dome. An EMIT is a paper-thin sheet of mylar with an aluminum circuit printed on it. suspended between samarium cobalt magnets. When current runs through that trace, the entire surface moves at once. That's the trick. A dome tweeter has a coil in the center, pushing a rigid dome. The dome has weight, and at very high frequencies it stops moving as one piece and starts deforming into itself. In an EMIT, there's no coil and no dome. The motor is spread across the whole membrane, and the mass per unit of area is almost nothing. Less mass, less inertia. And you already know that word. It's exactly the enemy this story started with, 8 years earlier, in a garage in Los Angeles. Except there's a detail here that almost nobody tells you. Nudell didn't invent the EMIT. It was designed by Daniel von Recklinghausen, raised in Munich, trained at MIT, and for 2 decades the chief research engineer at H.H. Scott, where he was one of the central figures in the development of FM radio in America. 24 patents. The Audio Engineering Society itself credits him with the EMIT, with no ambiguity at all. And the same tweeter was sold under another badge. KLH marketed it as the DVR, the initials of the man who designed it. Infinity had just escaped Ohm's license by fitting somebody else's design. But what they did with it was theirs. Instead of using 1 EMIT, or 2, they used 9, 8 facing forward, stacked in a column almost 4 feet tall, and 1 aimed backward, which you could switch off. The idea is called a line source. A conventional speaker radiates like a sphere. The energy halves every time you double the distance, and a lot of it bounces off the ceiling and the floor before it reaches you. A tall, narrow column radiates like a cylinder instead. It loses far less, and it hits the room far less. What you hear is more speaker and less room. Below that column sat 6 mid-range domes. Then a mid-bass coupler, and at the very bottom, a 12-inch woofer that looked like nothing else on the market. 17 drivers per cabinet, 5.5 feet tall, 190 pounds, 18 Hz to 32 kilohertz. They called it the quantum line source. QLS-1, $2,600 a pair, in 1976. And that woofer at the bottom. Infinity hadn't designed that either. This time the man behind it hadn't come out of a weapons lab or a nuclear division. He ran a stereo shop in Kingsport, Tennessee. His name was William Watkins. Bill. He'd been selling hi-fi since the late 50s. And in the back room of his own store, he was working on a problem the industry had written off as unsolvable. Every loudspeaker in a box has a resonant frequency. It's the note where the cone, the suspension, and the trapped air all want to vibrate on their own. And right there, something perverse happens. The impedance spikes. It triples. The amplifier, which delivers power based on the impedance it sees, stops delivering it exactly where it's needed most. That's where a rule the industry calls Hofmann's iron law comes from, named after one of the founders of KLH. It says you can pick 2 of these 3 things: small box, deep bass, high efficiency. Never all 3. Watkins didn't break it. He went around it. He wound a second voice coil over the main one. Single layer, with an absurdly low impedance, 2.5 ohms. So low that if it ran all the time, it would destroy itself. So it doesn't run all the time. A tuned circuit wakes it up only in the region of resonance, around 45 Hz. And there, where any coil's impedance triples, those 2.5 ohms become 8. Safe. The spike disappears. The amplifier goes back to delivering power exactly where it used to give up. And the speaker gains almost a full octave of bass. Patent 3838216, granted in 1974. Richard Small, one of the 2 men the Thiele-Small parameters are named after, spent 17 pages analyzing why it worked. And here's the part that decided the story. The first person who wanted the license wasn't Infinity. It was Henry Kloss. Kloss is the K in KLH. Before that, he'd co-founded acoustic research with Edgar Vilcher, the man this video opens with. In 1974, he was running Advent, and he wanted the Watkins woofer. He told one of his people to ship Watkins the parts he'd need: hole pieces, plates, magnets. Watkins waited. The parts never came. He assumed Kloss had lost interest, and went with Infinity. They called it the Infinity Watkins woofer. And with that, the company finally had both halves. EMIT on top, Watkins on the bottom. And an entire range built on that pairing. The Quantum 3, the Quantum 5, the Qua, the QB, the Quantum Junior. 10 years of refining parts, their own and other people's, until they had the best catalog on the market. But Nudell wanted something else. He wanted to build something with no price on it at all. They didn't design it to sell it. The IRS, Infinity Reference Standard, started as an internal reference, a machine built to find out where the ceiling was. Nudell wanted to know how far a loudspeaker could go if nobody was watching the price, or the size, or common sense. Like the Servo-Statik, it wasn't going to be for sale. And like the Servo-Statik, people heard it. The demand got so loud that Infinity ended up selling it to anyone who could pay. It was 4 towers, and not 4 boxes. 4 towers, 7.5 feet tall. 2 of them were bass only. 6 12-inch polypropylene woofers in each. The other 2 carried everything else. 24 EMITs facing forward and 12 aimed backward, plus 12 EMITs mid-ranges. In each tower, final count, 72 ribbon tweeters, 24 ribbon mid-ranges, and 12 woofers. 108 drivers to reproduce 2 channels of music. And the mid-range and treble towers didn't have straight sides. They had curved rosewood wings, calculated so the sound wouldn't break up at the edges, and filled with sand so the wood wouldn't resonate. They were built by a shipbuilder. But the important part was down at the bottom. Each bass tower had its own amplifier, 1,500 watts per channel, designed for that job and no other job. And inside it, the same principle this whole thing started with. Except now, instead of a sensing coil, there was an accelerometer, military grade. 16 Hz to 40,000. 16 Hz is below the threshold where the ear stops hearing and starts feeling. Down there, a loudspeaker doesn't sound. It pushes. $65,000. And the mid-range and treble towers didn't even come amplified. That was on the buyer, separately. A loudspeaker nobody had asked for, that the company didn't want to sell. That weighed as much as a small car. And it worked. From that moment on, everybody in this industry knew exactly who Infinity was, including a man named Sidney Harmon. Sidney Harmon wasn't a financier buying a factory. He was an engineer. In 1953, he'd founded Harman Kardon with Bernard Kardon, 2 employees of a public address company who struck out on their own. He bought out his partner in 1956. In the 60s, he picked up JBL. And then he did something almost nobody does. President Carter appointed him United States Deputy Secretary of Commerce. To avoid the conflict of interest, Harmon sold his company, the whole thing, to a food conglomerate called Beatrice Foods. When he came out of government, he set about buying it back, piece by piece. In 1980, he incorporated Harmon International with one purpose, to pry JBL loose from Beatrice. 3 years later, he got to Infinity. On paper, nothing changed. Nudell stayed in charge. Carrie Christie stayed 25 years, until 1993. Underneath, everything changed. Infinity stopped being 3 men arguing about how much money they were willing to lose on a loudspeaker nobody had asked for. It became a division inside a publicly traded group, with quarterly targets and a sales network that reached places where the letters IRS meant nothing at all. And that's where the part of this story almost everybody knows without knowing it begins. The Infinity logo on the dashboard of a Chrysler, a Hyundai, a Kia, bookshelf speakers in a department store. The same brand that built the most expensive loudspeaker on the planet, selling car speakers. That's the reason almost nobody today remembers what Infinity actually was. But here's the uncomfortable part. Harmon's money is exactly what made everything that comes next possible. A $65,000 system the company didn't even want to sell doesn't fund a decade of research. A mid-range catalog does. And with that network behind him, Nudell went into the 80s with more resources than he'd ever had in his life. The first thing he built became famous for the one reason no manufacturer wants. It ate amplifiers. The Kappa 9 was a 5-way loudspeaker, an EMIT super tweeter, an EMIT, a polydome mid-range, a 5-inch polygraph in polypropylene and graphite, and 2 12-inch cast-frame woofers. 5 feet tall. On the spec sheet, Infinity listed a nominal impedance of 4 to 6 ohms. The reality was something else. The Kappa 9's actual impedance curve drops below 1 ohm, and not at 1 point. At 2, around 33 Hz, and again near 7,000. To understand what that means, you need one piece of high school physics. The current flowing through a circuit is the voltage divided by the resistance. Divide by 4, and you get a number. Divide by less than 1, and you get that number multiplied by 4. An amplifier doesn't see a loudspeaker. It sees a load, and when that load collapses below 1 ohm, it has to deliver a current it probably was never designed for. Owners who've measured it talk about 9 amps, 11. The amplifiers that couldn't deliver did one of 2 things. They went into protection and shut down, or they didn't go into protection. But the revealing part isn't the curve, it's that there was a switch. On the back of the Kappa 9, Infinity fitted a base extension switch. In one position, the speaker ran as built. In the other, the circuit added a 5-ohm resistor that softened the dip. In normal mode, the minimum sat near 1.8 ohms. In extended mode, it collapsed to 7/10. Infinity knew exactly what it had built. They measured it, they understood the risk, and instead of fixing it, They gave the buyer a switch to choose between the two versions of the problem, and the box still said 4 to 6 ohms. This should be the end of a story about engineering arrogance. It isn't, because 40 years on, the Kappa 9 still commands a devotion that very few loudspeakers get. The people who own the right amplifier don't talk about impedance. They talk about the bass. They describe it as something they never heard again. And that's the contradiction that defines this company. The Servo-Statik broke on its own and was the most accurate speaker in existence. The Kappa 9 ate amplifiers and sounded like nothing else. Infinity never built comfortable loudspeakers. It built loudspeakers that made you rise to meet them. And while the Kappa range was chewing through power amps across half the country, Nudell was busy taking the IRS apart. The idea was simple, and nobody had pulled it off properly before. Take the IRS, 4 towers, 108 drivers, $65,000, and build smaller and smaller versions of the same system. Not different speakers with a family resemblance. The same speaker, shrunk, beta, gamma, delta, sigma, epsilon. But the interesting thing about this family isn't what they all had in common. It's one specific pair. The IRS gamma and the IRS delta are the same loudspeaker, same cabinet, same drivers, same crossover points. There is exactly one difference between them. The gamma has a servo control unit. The delta doesn't. Now watch what that box does. The delta, without the servo, goes down to 28 Hz. The gamma, with it, goes down to 15. There it is, measured. In 2 products from the same catalog, the same year, with exactly the same drivers inside. Almost a full octave of bass. That's the argument 2 engineers from a weapons lab couldn't prove to anybody in 1968, when they found an undeveloped block diagram in their company library. 19 years later, Infinity was selling it in 2 versions so the customer could pick one and hear the difference for himself. The Sigma launched at $10,000, the Epsilon at $14,000, and Nudell didn't design the Epsilon. Kerry Christie did. The third partner, the one building cabinets in his garage in 1968, who by then had been with the company for 25 years. His Epsilon retired the samarium cobalt magnets and replaced them with neodymium. It was one of the last things he did there, because while the IRS family was spreading through living rooms across the country, Nudell had gone back to look at the original tower, and he'd decided to build it again. They called it the Ears V, and it was, literally, the same thing he'd built 10 years earlier, except now he could afford it. 4 towers, 2 per channel. The 2 bass towers held 6 12-inch woofers each, 12 in total. The other 2 held 24 EMI mid-ranges and 72 EMITs, 12 of which aimed backward, at the wall, because Nudell was still obsessed with the same thing he'd been obsessed with in 1971. Final count, 108 drivers, 7.5 feet tall, 1,500 pounds, and the cabinets were still Brazilian rosewood. Each bass tower had its own 2,000-watt amplifier. Inside, it was an accelerometer measuring the cone's real motion, comparing it to the order it had been given, and correcting the difference thousands of times per second. That accelerometer is the direct grandchild of a bomb guidance system. 28 years after 2 Lytton employees walked across a hall and found an undeveloped block diagram in an acoustics textbook, the correction loop that held a laser steady on a target over Vietnam was moving 12 polypropylene cones in somebody's living room, 15 Hz to 45,000. Now, none of that explains why this loudspeaker is still remembered. For that, you have to talk about a house in Sea Cliff, New York. That's where Harry Pearson lived, the man who founded the absolute sound, and who essentially invented the vocabulary critics still use to describe what a loudspeaker does. When Pearson said something was the reference, the entire industry accepted it as the reference. In his listening room, he had a Goldman turntable, an Audio Research SP11 preamp, and an Ears Vi system. For years, the yardstick American High Fidelity measured itself against was this. When a manufacturer wanted to know whether his $20,000 loudspeaker was any good, the real question was how it sounded next to what was sitting in Pearson's house. Paul McGowan, who walked in there as a kid a few years out of college, said the sound was orders of magnitude beyond anything he'd ever heard. The price was $60,000, 33 times what the Servo-Statik cost, back where this story started. It was built until 1996, and here's the number almost nobody knows. In under a decade, Infinity built 58 pairs. 58, less than one every 2 months. They're serial numbered. There are people out there who know they own number 2, and people who know they own number 37. Think about what that means. The company that at that exact moment was putting speakers into dashboards across half the country with a publicly traded group behind it, spent close to 10 years building 58 pairs of a machine almost nobody could buy and nobody needed. They didn't do it for the money. 58 units doesn't recover a decade of research. They did it because Arnie Nudell had spent since 1966 trying to answer one question: how far can you go? And this was his answer. Nudell left in 1991. He founded Genesis Technologies with Paul McGowan, the co-founder of PS Audio, with a push from Harry Pearson himself. Their flagship system launched at $235,000. And it was, essentially, an updated IRS. 25 years after pulling that book off an engineering library shelf, he was still building the same machine. Carrie Christie lasted 2 more years. Ulrick had left long before that. He started Spectron and spent the rest of his life building switching amplifiers, precisely the technology he'd learned designing weapons systems. All 3 founders gone. Infinity kept going, and kept doing good work. In the year 2000, it launched the Prelude MTS, $8,000 a pair, with drivers made of aluminum coated in ceramic on both faces. Stereophile praised it with almost no reservations. But there's one figure in that review that tells the entire story in a single line. The Prelude MTS held its impedance at 4 ohms, plus or minus 1, across the whole audible bandwidth. The reviewer called it an engineering feat. 13 years earlier, this same company had sold a loudspeaker that collapsed below 1 ohm and came with a switch on the back so you could choose how much risk you wanted to run. Infinity had stopped building loudspeakers that challenged you. And there's a great deal left out of this video. The entire monitor series, the RS line, the Renaissance, the Modulus, the Intermezzo, the Primus. Whole decades of catalog. Today Infinity belongs to Samsung, which bought Harman in 2017 for $8 billion. Go to their website and you'll find car speakers and marine speakers. And in their own marketing, Harman still explains that the brand was born by blending aeronautical design with audio technology. They're still telling people where they came from. Arnie Nudell died in November of 2017, at 80 years old. At the beginning of this story, there was a loudspeaker called the Metragon. It was the most expensive one in America, until 3 men out of a garage beat it. It was built by JBL, and JBL exists for exactly one reason: because an engineer walked out the door of another company on the precise day his contract expired. His name was James Bullough Lansing. When he set up his new company, he discovered he couldn't put his own surname on it. He'd already sold it. The company that bought it carried the sound of Hollywood movie theaters and ended up putting it inside your living room. It was called Altec Lansing, and that story is right here.